Now let's talk about particular forms of exercise and how they modulate the steroid hormones. And then we're going to talk about various supplements, both in reference to testosterone and in reference to estrogen. So now let's talk about how exercise in its various forms, weight training, endurance work, weight training to failure, or less intense weight training, can impact testosterone levels. But I want to remind you that we're talking about testosterone both in males and females. And based on what you know from earlier in the episode, testosterone can have numerous positive effects in both males and females, provided they're in optimal range. So if you look on the web, people say, testosterone is increased by weight training. You want to do big, heavy compound movements, squats and deadlifts and chins and things of that sort. But what about the scientific studies? Like, what's the actual basis for this? Because if you just take a step back and look at this from the perspective of a scientist, you'd say, okay, what is a squat? A squat is loading up a bunch of weights on a bar and then, sitting down essentially and standing up over and over again. What's a deadlift? It's lifting heavy weights from the ground. Why would that increase testosterone, right? This is what's often not discussed in the weight training or even the exercise science community. What would actually stimulate the release of testosterone from the adrenals and or testes, and which one is it? And that's often not discussed, but as a neuroscientist, this is the kinds of things we think about because we think always that genes don't create behavior, immune systems don't know when to be activated, lungs don't know when to inhale or exhale, hearts don't know when to beat, except for the information that it gets from neurons. The nervous system controls all of that. And so really the answer has to be in the neural system that's related to these particular types of weight-bearing exercises. So when you go into this literature, it's kind of hard to find real mechanism. You see a lot of effects. You'll hear things like androgen receptor content, meaning testosterone and its derivatives, receptor content following heavy resistance exercise. And you'll find some examples that, for instance, they do muscle biopsies. They can actually see receptor increases looking at either high volume or low volume, really intense exercise. And you can find a lot of that, but not a lot of mechanism about how the nervous system would do this. And the reason you'd want to know how it can do it is that you could potentially build better protocols or figure out exactly what about these movements is triggering increases in androgen receptors and testosterone. So what's interesting is when you start digging into the more mechanistic studies, what you find is that heavy weight training, so this is weight training where the sets are done with anywhere from kind of 1 to 8 rep range. So this translates differently depending on ratio of muscle fiber type and so forth. But where basically people are working at anywhere from like 70% to 95% of their maximum, or sometimes even going right down to their 1 repetition maximum, really kind of, max effort. What you find is that using the nervous system in a way in which they're moving heavy loads, so that I would translate to recruitment of high threshold motor units for you muscle physiologists. And there's a rule in muscle physiology about neuron recruitment for moving muscles where you basically use the minimum number of motor units of neurons to activate muscle as you possibly can. As loads increase, you have to recruit more and more neurons. You always hear about recruiting muscle fibers, but really it's recruiting more neurons to recruit more muscle fibers. And what you find is that heavy weight training, but not weight training to failure, where completion of a repetition is impossible, leads to the greatest increases in testosterone. Now, I'm sure there are a bunch of exercise jockeys out there that are going to, come at me with a bunch of things where, but high volume and this and training to failure and that. Sure. If you're willing to kind of put things side by side, adjust for exogenous testosterone treatment and all the rest, which was done in these studies, what you find in general is that weight training with heavy loads, so anywhere from 1 rep maximum to somewhere in the 6 to 8 repetition range, in males or females, increases testosterone significantly. And it does it for about a day, sometimes up to 48 hours. And the studies that I found, which seem to hold the most rigor or weight based on where they're published, as opposed to being published in the journal, I've never heard of it. They're published in good quality exercise physiology journals. For instance, the paper by Ratames, Ratames et al., which was published in 2005, which talks about modulations in androgen receptor content after heavy resistance exercise, looks at going to failure, not to failure. The work of Izquierdo et al., published in 2006, differential effects of strength training leading to failure versus not failure on hormonal responses, strength, and power gains. There are a lot of studies here, and I will certainly put the links to these in the caption. Many of these actually include Duncan French, who runs the UFC Training Center, but they all point to the fact that there's something about the engagement of the neurons that recruit high threshold motor units in muscle when moving heavy loads but not to failure that has to provide some sort of feedback signal either to the gonad to produce more testosterone or is increasing the activity of receptors in the body. Now, why do I say that? Well, this is the puzzle, right? How is it that a particular movement, just like how is it that interacting with your child is increasing or decreasing testosterone? This is the kind of fundamental question at the mechanistic level. And we answered the question for child rearing. It has probably something to do with smell and pheromones, although I'm sure there are other cues as well. But there's clearly a influence of hard work at the neural level and then at the muscular level for increasing testosterone. And there's also clearly an effect of working too hard and presumably increasing cortisol too much, although I'm speculating there, in terms of reducing testosterone. And so the reason we're getting nitty-gritty about this is because ultimately we'd really like to understand what are the optimal protocols. You know, out there in the literature you hear move heavy objects to increase testosterone. Some of that will be converted to the more powerful androgen DHT by 5-alpha reductase, etc. But we really don't understand yet how these particular behaviors increase testosterone and whether or not it's doing that by modulating the receptors or it's modulating testosterone release directly, presumably testosterone release directly and sensitivity of the receptors. That's what most of the muscle physiology studies that I was able to find point to. But this basically boils down to a particular set of protocols where if you want to increase testosterone for whatever reason, that weight training with heavy loads but not to failure seems to be the best supported, at least scientifically supported solution to that. Now, it may not raise your testosterone levels as high as you want, but it's definitely taking things in the correct direction.